Welcome back to the Content That Grows podcast. Today I'm sitting back down with my co-founder, Kevin King. What's up, Kevin?
Not much. What's up, Nate?
Just ready to dig in on all things measuring content distribution. I think it's going to be good conversation. I think it's one that maybe doesn't get covered as much. There's a lot of people that certainly are out there telling you to distribute content more, and some good stuff on how to distribute content, but measuring distribution, I think, is a very real thing for a lot of people, in-house, agencies, all kinds of places. So excited to really dig in on that today and kind of build on what we've been covering this season with sort of the distribution and repurposing of content. So with that, I think the general feeling on a lot of this is that there's not a clear way to do it, and there's some challenges that come with that. And so I think what we really wanted to do was spend the bulk of the time kind of going through a number of the challenges that we know of, that we've experienced, the companies we work with have experienced, and go there, and then towards the end of the episode kind of shift into some of the other stuff with that. So we have 5 of the core ones we've kind of prepared for today and talked through. And so getting started, Kevin, love just have you kind of talk us through the first one, get going.
Yeah, definitely. The first one I think is definitely one of the most challenging, but really that attribution is really, really tough. Very similar to SEO. We talk about that. We've talked about that on previous podcasts, but basically just measuring content distribution can be challenging from an attribution standpoint for a variety of ways, just because of like the lack of maybe driving direct conversions, right? Like I think that ultimately at the day that's what people are looking at, right? So I think that's it. Attribution is really tough.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that's again, with many things like you said, SEO or just content in general, when there's that perceived expectation that it should drive direct conversions, makes it very, very difficult. And so, one of the big areas there is just kind of understanding how what you're doing with distribution is ultimately playing towards the larger business outcomes that you want.
Yeah. And there's just so many channels and so many different ways that people are going to engage with your content. So it's just hard to really, really directly attribute anything that you're trying to generate from a business perspective that's going to ultimately push the needle. But it's still important to not ignore everything that comes along with what you're measuring from an attribution standpoint. So, moving on to number 2, what we have is audience building, right? It takes time to build, so that could be pretty challenging for teams to understand for a while because the results might be pretty underwhelming.
I totally agree. I mean, I think there's we certainly work with a decent number of seed stage startups that are doing good things, getting things going, maybe a marketing team of 1 or 2 people, but the reality is that the number of followers that they have on any social channels or the size of their email list or any of that stuff is still pretty small. It's getting going, and therefore the distribution, just outright distribution of just sharing in these channels doesn't have quite the reach and impact as it does for larger. I mean, we're experiencing that for ourselves too, just coming from larger SaaS companies and places we've worked and kind of where we're at now of growing this company. Like, we're definitely dealing with much smaller numbers as well in what we're working with. So I think there's one important thing that I would add there is it just, I think, becomes a matter of how you're distributing. And so this isn't as much, I guess, of a measurement thing, but like the fact that it takes a while to build your lists and your audience is like shouldn't dissuade you from doing it. It's just a matter of some of the creative ways we've listed out of like more like co-marketing or getting in front of other people's audiences that will just kind of help expand your reach, but then also help you build your audience faster too. So But yeah, I think it's a very real challenge early on to when you're stretched as a team, balancing the bandwidth and who you're, where should I put my time? It can be hard to say, I'm going to put time into content distribution knowing that the audiences are small. Totally agree. It's a great point.
Yep. There's a lot of, it can be demoralizing. I mean, I can know from my personal brand building on social and things of that, but, consistency is key. We say that when it comes to anything content. You got to stick with it, and don't be discouraged by things that you see out there where people are generating a lot of interest and you haven't gotten there yet, because it just takes time.
Yeah, totally agree.
So the third one we have is that basically there's not one perfect tool for measurement. There's so many tools out there when it comes to distribution. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think this is a big one for sure, because I think you look at other things, SEO, like you can pretty well measure most of what you want to measure that's important in Search Console. You can layer on maybe one additional tool with Ahrefs or SEMrush or anything like that, and really have pretty much the breadth of what you need there. And I think the distribution side of it just expands so much more to one, whatever channels you're using. So there's say you're distributing on 4 or 5 different social networks and doing quite a bit. That's a lot of data to pull together. Maybe you use something like Sprout Social that pulls all of it into like aggregated analytics. But even for us, in the efforts that we have for promoting 10-speed, we still have to pull data. We use like Shield for like LinkedIn to be able to at least aggregate the data on multiple LinkedIn profiles into one. So we have to pull all that data. We pull data from Castos on the podcast. We pull data from YouTube, HubSpot for like a lot of the website data, the newsletter, email stuff that we do there, and that's even like I think pretty minimal compared to some larger companies and the level of distribution that they have. So it is very challenging. There's just a lot to try to pull together. Impression doesn't mean the same thing, or reach or whatever. Like the stats don't combine. Like there's just a lot of factors to it that does make it challenging to really pull together some good data on the content distribution.
Yeah, for sure. It's really challenging. It really depends on what the tools you're using are, and it can get even more challenging because there are tools out there that have their own proprietary calculation. If you're like plugging in multiple tools that you're distributing content out to, so then you're like, oh well, does that work for me? And it could, but it all depends. I don't want to call it one tool specifically, but I've seen that before, and some can be reliable, and maybe that's the way you want to go. But yeah, the measurement across various tools it's really, really tough to pull together.
Yeah, I think there's like as much as some people probably would hate to admit it, I think that a lot of marketers thrive on like standardization. I think that's been like traffic metrics are pretty safe, pretty clear. There's like, conversion rate metrics, and there's different things, different aspects of marketing and the marketing disciplines, and, PPC and whatever, like some of those metrics on, cost per lead or whatever, like those different things. I think people have like good framework and understanding of like, yeah, here's some of the core metrics you should be tracking for this channel or these tactics, and content distribution at a high level, I think just feels much more of a mystery, or just like what should be tracked, what are the standards, how do we look at this, what is good, how do I even know what's good, and it's much harder to compare to others when you're distributing via newsletter and LinkedIn posts and your podcast, and someone else has a lot of videos and webinars and whatever, Twitter and Reddit, and you're like this, apples and oranges, and just there's so many variables to it. I think just it definitely makes it pretty tough.
Yeah, so it's intimidating. I mean,
Yep.
you're pulling together a ton of metrics that you're ultimately going to have to explain to, somewhere up the ladder, right? That is going to need to understand this in like a really easy to understand way, and it's probably one of the most complex and ways of having to explain what you're doing from a marketing perspective, because it's spread out across so many different things.
Yeah.
Early on, it might not be if you're doing a few different things across various channels, but it can be intimidating.
Yep. Sure.
So moving on to number 4, we have really predictability and forecasting. A lot of other more, let's say, straightforward marketing tactics can be modeled out, right, in a much more straightforward way. I think when it comes to the distribution aspect of content, it can be really, really tough to actually put something down on paper to give to the team, or again, up the ladder, up the chain, however you want to say it, to give them some confidence or idea of where this is going and why we should invest in distribution.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think there's it's a really good point, because I think at least from my experience in working with CEOs and executives, I think a lot of times the question that they're asking of marketing is like, if we double the investment here, what would we get from it? Or if we can give you more, maybe it's not double, but if we can give you more, what should we expect? And that makes sense at an executive level, that they're trying to understand, whatever, I have $100,000. Do I put it into like sales and outbound stuff? Do I put it into product development? Do I put it into marketing? And so you want to have some idea of that. And I think for a long time, people have had a pretty good way of forecasting that on the paid side, whether that's like paid social or paid search or ABM or whatever. It's not as concrete, but we still have a pretty good way of forecasting, organic results and SEO and some of that stuff. Content distribution is so much harder, and again, kind of going back to even just like posting on LinkedIn personally, like some things work really, really well and take off and get a lot of distribution and even generate leads and whatever, and others kind of just feel like they flop and it's hard to know. And so I think that becomes challenging to say, because either you're like, we're going to distribute into new like channels, a new social network, or repurpose into videos, start building on YouTube, in which case you don't have a baseline, so that's hard to forecast. Or you're just saying, okay, well, we're going to post twice as much on the places we are, but you still don't really know, like, where's the diminishing returns and the cap on that and everything. So I agree. I mean, I think it is very, very challenging aspect of this from an executive investment, like trying to give them something to work with. There's a lot to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's those dang algorithms, right?
Yeah.
We can talk about a bunch of social networks specifically from a distribution standpoint, but you're at the mercy of those, and like those are preventing any sense of predictability. Maybe if you can figure out some way within some of these like ecosystems to be able to like, see some consistency and build off of that and understand, oh, well, I've been doing this, so we should expect this if we do more of it. But it's still so tough, like we've tested so much too, right, from a brand perspective and our personal profiles and things like that. And I know I'm speaking really specifically around social, but that's such a big part of content distribution these days. And and like there's just so hard, unless you're controlling, you have some sort of control over the distribution channel, right? Like I remember we used to syndicate content to some extent and get content through specific networks that had audiences that they knew how big they were and all that, right? Like, and they could possibly maybe guarantee that you'd get in front of a certain number of eyeballs. So like that gives you a way to model out and predict how far your content's going to go and all that. But it's just,
Yeah.
it's really tough when these things are, which is maybe a nice segue into the next, but evolving quickly and changing.
Yeah. Well, I would say, I think yes, algorithms of social networks and some of that is definitely harder. I think even stuff you own, like your newsletter list or whatever, like say you have 1,000 subscribers on your newsletter list, and they said, okay, well, if we could invest money in LinkedIn ads to get people to sign up for our newsletter, we have 40% open rate and, et cetera, et cetera. Even still, like, you don't know once you have 40% open rate of people who sort of organically opted into your newsletter. If you go get a bunch of subscribers to your newsletter from ads, there's a decent chance that they're not going to be as qualified. There will be more unsubs. Like, the open rate will decline. Like, just even modeling something you own and you have your own data on that, like trying to grow that, I think can be fairly challenging too.
Yeah. And you can be certain that they won't necessarily convert directly to a lead and predict that. Yeah. And go like, they open this many people open our newsletter. They're going to go further down our funnel, right? They're just newsletter signups now, but they're going to be this. You can't predict that.
Yeah, maybe never. Yeah.
Yeah, and they may come back in through some other piece of content that didn't come through the newsletter, right? So it's crazy. So I mentioned this in the last challenge, but the last one that we have talked about or pre-planned is really the space, I guess, for lack of a better word, is evolving really quickly. I keep really referring to the social aspect of things, but there's new tools out there, there's new networks out there, there's new channels out there pretty frequently, and they're tweaking the people that control those businesses are changing those quite frequently. I mean, think about where LinkedIn, Twitter, all those were years ago. Those have evolved so much in just 5 years, right? 4 years, 3 years, even a couple of years. So leave it at that. The space is evolving quickly, so that makes really measuring success very, very difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's that's an area where a lot of people, have sort of that caution of like building your audience in places you don't own, because 100,000 followers on any network or whatever may not matter as much if changes to things like substantially decrease the reach you have and even getting in front of your own followers and whatever. So I think that's certainly a factor and something that you do need to have balanced. Like, you can't build on everyone else's land entirely. Like, you need to have a good balance of your own stuff. But recognizing that those places do offer a ton of reach and be able to get in front of people that you wouldn't otherwise get in front of. But yes, I mean, I think it moves so quickly. Changes happen a lot. I think the Facebook stuff, primarily around like the privacy and what that did to advertisers, which is not as much distribution unless you are doing paid distribution. Some of that stuff came very abruptly and it kind of rocked a lot of companies, especially e-commerce companies that were heavily dependent on Facebook ads. But you just never know. It evolves quickly. Like, the amount of distribution that's happening already on TikTok for B2B companies, growing pretty quickly. The number of TikTok videos that are showing up inside of LinkedIn, like being sort of cross-posted there, I think has grown substantially over time and stuff. So, I mean, I think there's just a lot there that it definitely makes it a challenge of like, this new thing pops up and you have the question of like, should we be there? Is our audience there? Does our audience want our content even if they are there? Just a lot of those questions that come up.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and like adds to the complexity and confusing nature of all of this. Like, the reposting, TikTok's so big now, the reposting of TikTok on Instagram. But like, what if your TikTok videos are more effective on Instagram? Like how do you measure? You can measure that, of course, right? And that can be something that you decide you want to do, but it becomes so nuanced and so hard to predict. But that's part of how the space is evolving quickly. Is like TikTok's new, and people are trying new tactics based on that new additional channel or network. So.
So the interesting thing I'll say to kind of wrap this portion of it up is we just went through 5 things that we view as kind of the challenges around measuring content distribution. And not a lot of it had to actually do with metrics, which I think is worth noting, that it is a little bit, somewhat, with attribution and not one perfect tool for measurement and stuff like that. But, it's not just a metrics thing or like a tooling thing. Like there's some bigger, broader things that make measuring it a little bit more of a challenge, even if we still very much believe in the power of it. So, so I think with that, kind of move on. It would be helpful to kind of go through a couple things that we see or encounter that are like some incorrect assumptions about measuring content distribution.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's 3 that really come to mind. But ultimately, the big one, which I think comes up a lot in marketing or when it comes to any marketing tactics, but basically, if your distribution methods aren't generating leads or revenue, it's not working. That's a big thing we've seen for a long time, and it's just not true. As we just talked about, there's complexities and nuances to how you measure distribution. So that's one. Quote unquote vanity metrics, which these have evolved over time, but vanity metrics don't matter. I think that's a really common incorrect assumption, and that's can be a few things or a variety of things depending on how you define them. Like it could be likes, favorites, depending on the network, right? But these can be important depending on the framework or model in which you're measuring your distribution methods, and then. Your brand needs a presence everywhere. I feel like this is lower on the list, but still something that we see often. But ultimately, different channels, different networks are more effective for different industries, different businesses. So it's just not the case. You don't need to be in the new thing just because it's the new thing.
Yeah.
That's
I think I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the vanity metrics thing and like the lead generation, I think those kind of go hand in hand almost, of like in terms of a perspective on what you should be measuring. And I think the thing that we've believed for a long time is like, one, there are no concrete like, oh, this specific metric is a vanity metric no matter what across every business. That's not the case. It definitely depends. And I think the only time it becomes a vanity metric is when, one, it doesn't tie to some like influencing some larger, more effective metric that matters to the business. And 2, you're sort of like the reason it's called vanity is like that you're propping it up and making it seem like a big deal and like building that it's a success. And so I think like, total number of likes on your social posts in a month very much can be a vanity metric. If you're like, this is awesome. We have 10,000 likes this month. And if that's where it stops, then it might be, yeah. But if it's like, hey, we had 10,000 likes on our post this month and it increased our distribution this much, and we, gained this many followers in our audience and actually got, a couple people reached out or leads or whatever, like you're sort of tying those things to like, no, it's not just about the likes. Like, I don't care if it's 10,000 or a million. Here's like what actually mattered to the business. I think helps a lot. So I don't think it's like, I guess my point is, don't run away from things that maybe people have labeled as vanity metrics in the past. If there's a clear tie to like, if we do this, it's going to help X or Y in the business and help grow the business.
Yeah. Yeah, timely article came out this week from SparkToro, Rand Fishkin around like hard to measure channels, right? And he says something that's really, to your point, it's similar to what the point you just made, which is that like, you have 10,000 likes and it stops there. It's, that's then vanity. But what he talks about is really just directional lift over the efforts that you're doing from a marketing perspective or content perspective, which is, if yes, you are generating 10,000 likes and over time that's very consistent and you are generating more leads and that's lifting and your traffic's going up, then like you can make some really, really strong assumptions, which I know scares marketing leaders to hear assumptions, but that things are working the way that you want them to, right? And if you stopped doing those things, it probably would stop. Everything else would stop, right? So it's really important to think about it that way, and I think he frames it up really, really nicely.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely recommend checking out that article, which I don't have the title of it handy at the moment, but we can pull that up in just a sec. But definitely check it out. I think it was very timely because it came out just now with us planning to do this and very much validated a lot we're doing. So yeah, it's called how to measure quote hard to measure marketing channels. And so, definitely, good read, and there's some good examples. And we're going to talk in a second about like actual metrics to track and stuff, which I think there's even more detail that he offers in there than what we're going to be able to cover on the podcast today. But definitely agree with that. And I wanted to touch on your other point too, just the brands need to have a presence everywhere. Sort of an incorrect assumption. I think we've talked about that a decent amount in terms of like distribution strategy and just a number of times that it really is about understanding where your audience is, where they're spending time, and want to consume the kind of content that you're distributing, I think matters greatly. And so again, whether you're a marketing team of one or a larger team, like where you spend your time and what you get from spending that time matters. You want to be as effective as possible. And so I think being willing to make those decisions and not try to spread yourself thin and be everywhere all at once, I think is a really, really important thing to factor into how you measure content distribution. So it's not just let's try to be everywhere because that'll make the total numbers bigger and make it seem like it's more effective. Like that's definitely not the way to go.
Yeah, I agree. And I think like over time, the most effective way to approach that specific kind of like desire has always been to, start somewhere and just like add more as things work or don't work, I think everyone, especially earlier on, try to spin up at least something to be everywhere to some extent or try to. And that's just not the case. And then even later on, they still do that, right? Like we're like, oh, let's just keep building these channels up or profiles up or whatever. But yeah, it's tale old as time. I don't think you need to be everywhere. Really just where your audience is.
Yep. So I hope this hasn't felt too doom and gloom so far, but I think it's helpful to one, help people understand that if they're feeling this way about some of the measurement of content distribution, they're not alone. Like it is definitely a challenging thing and some validation there. But did want to kind of end on maybe something, it's not prescriptive by any means, but maybe just a little bit more directional in what you can be doing to measure some of your content distribution efforts. So one, kind of going back to what we said before about like there's not a perfect tool. It is going to require some manual consolidation of that. Again, that SparkToro article did call out that as well, and like give some examples of building in spreadsheet. The example I gave of how we pull all of our data, we compile all of that into a spreadsheet, and it's just sort of the reality of that situation right now. And so that is part of it, is just know that you'll have to compile data from multiple places into one and find a way to organize it. And so the few things that we really look at that are probably pretty applicable for most businesses, and it may vary. One is obviously impressions, and so the perspective there is like, again, this is almost kind of going back to like old school advertising. Like it's just reach. It's getting your name out there. It's getting in as long as you're kind of in the right places, targeting the right audience. That you are getting growing the number of impressions over time. If you have enough impressions, you could maybe do some math on like what would be sort of a CPM on an ad buy of like cost per 1,000 impressions, and understand the value of some of that reach that you have there. But at the basic level, I think that's a big one. It's just kind of just measuring how much you're getting out in front of people. Engagement with your target audience, I think, is important too. Especially on social, some of that, like if you're getting a lot of reactions and stuff from just the wrong people, that's not as valuable as like, hey, we're going after head of sales at SaaS companies, and we have a bunch of head of sales commenting on our posts and sharing it and whatever. Like that's definitely something worth measuring and understanding, is that engagement with your target audience. Probably a little bit older and like been around for a while, but still I think very effective, is sort of whether you combine it or split it out. I've seen both ways. Branded organic queries, so people that are specifically searching your brand name or iterations of your brand name, and direct traffic, I think are two that you will want to see growing over time. It's not a fast lift typically, but something you want to see. And then lastly, sort of email subscribers and total audience growth are two that I put in. So obviously email subscribers or anything else like that you sort of own that aspect of it, and you're growing your own list is important. But then also whether it's followers on your LinkedIn page or whatever it may be, just sort of like, how is your total audience growing with podcast subscribers, any of that kind of stuff. So I think that's kind of 4 areas that we look to. We've seen a number of SaaS companies kind of measure in those areas, because it kind of gives you like, what's the total reach? How are we getting in front of people? Some positive signals that we're getting in front of the right people by the engagement with target audience. Some of the more traffic lift, like we're actually getting people to the site and engaging with us there. And then sort of your like owned and not owned audience growth that you have there. So that's kind of my thoughts on that at the moment.
Yeah, I agree. The one I want to call back to though is just impressions. I think historically, well, I'll take a step back and say that many of these we report on when it comes to our content efforts, which is really not maybe just shows that that's important, but like we have a way that we have built to make sure that I think people can understand, that businesses can understand that these few metrics are actually pushing the needle in the right direction. Impressions being one of them, especially the branded ones. And the one thing that I'd love to just like add on that is like, if you're building irrelevant content, then of course impressions don't matter, because their impressions are just eyeballs, right? They're not doing anything other than seeing something, regardless of the platform. But if you are building targeted content, then impressions really matter. They do, and especially growing them and compounding them over time. So I know in search, impressions mean maybe your content's not on the first page, right? But they could be at some point, and they're moving in that direction. So it's like we have to understand that and monitor that and communicate the importance of it, because at some point those impressions can turn into clicks and traffic and all those things. So I'm a big impressions fan. I think it's good to understand that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think I still have this distinct memory because I tracked total organic impressions and blog specific organic impressions at Sprout for a number of years. And I remember that it got noticed by some folks when we hit like pretty consistently start hitting 1 million organic impressions a month. Of kind of like, oh wow, okay, like, not that it was sudden because it was climbing there, but like just hits that and you're like, okay, That's a million impressions per month. Like we're coming up, like that's pretty substantial. And then, sure enough, keep going with that, and eventually, it became, a million organic visits a month, and then you're like, like that does become substantial. But there's sort of that leading indicator, particularly with organic search, that you're like, okay, we're showing up, we're getting there, we're getting in front of people, even if they didn't click on our result, like, we're showing up. And I'm not here to try to put a quantified value on organic search impression, but I just remember that stands out to me as something I remember being like, impressions were notable and taken seriously, in some cases. So I think it's a good thing to be looking at over time.
When your Google Search Console, when you're collecting so many impressions and Google Search Console starts to load slowly when you compare data,
yeah,
and it's relevant, that means you're doing something right.
Yeah, still frustrating, but it's yeah.
Yeah, it takes longer to pull reporting, but it's a meaningful signal.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think this has been great conversation for this topic of measuring content distribution. I think in many ways still very early in a space that's, as we said, sort of dealing with things that evolve quickly, and how do you kind of measure all that, and then also just different for everybody. So I think don't be discouraged. I think as much as you can, build a case around some of these metrics we did just talk about, and understanding how that's changing over time. And most things you should be able to go pretty far back and pull it. So if you don't have them, go pull back as far as you can, so you really can be able to see, year over year growth sooner than later, and be able to kind of use some of that to guide some of your decisions. So if you like this episode and you want to check out more, be sure to visit 10speed.io/podcast, where we have all prior episodes, audio and video versions on our site. You can also sign up to be notified when new episodes drop there. And as well, just feel free to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you might be listening to podcasts. But yeah, this has been great. Thanks a lot, Kevin. It's a good conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Nate.